Racism, misogyny, and homophobia. Those are the core elements of Canada's Royal Canadian Mounted Police, according to a new report just issued this week. The RCMP's toxic culture goes well beyond discrimination in the workplace and includes violent sexual assaults, rapes, stalking, harassment, and physical and psychological abuse. The long-held RCMP myth of a few bad apples has been busted wide open. Welcome back, warriors. In today's video, we will be looking at the key findings of the Broken Dreams, Broken Lives report about sexual harassment in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada's national police force. The report was written by former Supreme Court of Canada Justice Michel Bastarache, who has been engaged as an independent assessor to review the more than 3,000 claims of sexual harassment experienced by women who worked for the RCMP. The assessor explained that the level of violence and sexual assault reported over the decades was shocking, with more than 130 women who had been violently raped by the RCMP. The experiences of these women RCMP officers and staff were nothing short of devastating. The report details what it referred to as heartbreaking stories of despair and a long list of psychological injuries, including major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, panic attacks, substance dependence, and even suicide. As stated in the report, quote, "It is impossible to fully convey the depth of the pain that the assessors witnessed, and, quote, no amount of financial compensation can undo the harm these women and their families experienced at the hands of the RCMP in all provinces and territories. This has, quote, forever tarnished the image of the RCMP as a Canadian icon." But the real tragedy here is that this isn't news. Not to the RCMP, the federal government, or provincial and territorial governments. All of them have known about this long-standing, widespread problem of racism, misogyny, homophobia, and sexualized violence within the RCMP for decades. And we should all care very deeply about the findings of this report, not only for the many women inside the RCMP who have suffered violence and trauma at the hands of their male colleagues, but because this has and continues to represent a major public safety crisis for women generally, but especially for Indigenous, Black, and marginalized women not in the RCMP. So today I'm going to share the 5 most important findings of this report. The first one, RCMP culture is toxic. The RCMP is a male-dominated paramilitary organization that is racist, misogynistic, and homophobic, and has caused incalculable damage to women inside of the RCMP. This powerful toxic culture has prevailed despite decades of well-known problems, including many reports and even litigation on this issue. It has also prevailed despite policy changes within the RCMP because, as the report notes, culture eats policy every time. And this explains how, despite all of these policy changes, there are increasing complaints against the RCMP. Indeed, there are strong reasons to doubt that the RCMP has the capacity or the will to make the necessary changes to address the toxic aspects of its culture. Number 2, the RCMP tormented and assaulted women within its own force. The RCMP treated women as, quote, fresh meat, and male RCMP not only engaged in, quote, serious acts of penetrative sexual assaults, but also unwelcome sexual touching, men exposing their penises, men making degrading comments about women's bodies, widespread humiliating name-calling, spreading violent and obscene pornography, often forcing women to watch it, handcuffing women within the RCMP to men's toilets or locking them in cells, being accused of selling sex, outing their sexual orientation without their consent. stalking by male RCMP officers demanding sexual relationships, and bullying by male RCMP officers demanding sexual favors from the women that worked there. Number 3, the RCMP also preyed on Indigenous women. The RCMP treated Indigenous women in the RCMP even more poorly than other women. In addition to the racist and sexist name-calling and harassment and all of the behaviors listed previously, Indigenous women were at times forced to watch RCMP members treat other Indigenous peoples brutally. The report went on to note that, quote, Indigenous women, particularly those who had been abused as children, were preyed upon by their male colleagues for sexual favors. Yet, RCMP leadership act like they don't believe systemic racism exists, or, as stated in the report, they are willfully blind. Number 4, RCMP's sexual harassment is not limited to a few bad apples. The report found that RCMP members and their leaders deny the systemic and cultural nature of the sexual harassment and instead rely on the few bad apples justification to protect their organization's status quo. The assessment found that there were RCMP men at, quote, every level of seniority that repeatedly harassed or sexually assaulted women, that sexual harassment and discrimination is, quote, found at every level of the RCMP and in every geographic area of Canada, and that, quote, sexual discrimination is embedded in its culture. They also noted that while there may have been well-intended RCMP members and leaders, they too made choices to accept the culture and stay silent about the injustices. Which leads me to the 5th and final finding from this report. The RCMP cannot be fixed from within. The RCMP's toxic culture based on racism, misogyny, and homophobia is, quote, powerful and presents an obstacle to change, and, quote, financial settlements of class action lawsuits will not change this culture. They went on to say the inability to acknowledge that a problem exists will inevitably render attempts to address the problem ineffective. In fact, many of the women that had been interviewed felt that there was no chance for reform within the RCMP, and some suggested it was time that it be replaced. The report also documented these men were often not held accountable for their actions. Indeed, the assessors were told that one tactic used by the RCMP to resolve complaints of sexual harassment was to promote and transfer these men. The assessor also found that the RCMP are invested in the status quo and will not likely want to make the necessary changes to eradicate this toxic culture. And relying on the RCMP to investigate and implement remedial action has not been effective. The ultimate conclusion was that it was long past time for governments to ask some hard questions about the future of federal policing in Canada, and that any action would have to come from outside of the RCMP. So the question is, what happens now? These women from the RCMP, many of whom were police themselves, have suffered immensely, and despite the financial settlement, many will suffer long-lasting psychological impacts. And what of the many thousands of Black and Indigenous women and girls who don't work inside the RCMP, that have been preyed upon, who have been targeted, stalked, harassed, exploited, and sexually assaulted by RCMP officers? Where is the justice for these women who have long called on federal, provincial, and territorial governments to act on RCMP sexualized violence? That is where you all come in. We need you to put pressure on all levels of government to hold the RCMP accountable and make reparations. We also need you to put pressure on the federal government to hold an independent investigation into the RCMP and open the books on this toxic organization. Even the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has called on Canada to investigate sexualized violence committed by the RCMP against Indigenous women and called on them to enact a zero tolerance policy. None of these RCMP predators should be working anymore. I know this won't be easy for many of the families of RCMP who have to hear about how widespread their acts of infidelity and sexual assaults are, but it's time we confronted this head on. The basic human rights, safety, security, and dignity of women inside and outside of the RCMP have been violated in horrific and violent ways. It's long past time this sick organization was dismantled once and for all. Thank you for watching, listening, sharing, and taking action to demand accountability from all levels of government for this public safety crisis. It simply cannot continue unabated. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.